Good morning, David. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Penny?
We're here today to talk about Dora, which stands for the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which comes into place, I think, in 2025. Is that right?
That's correct. The guidelines for it are still apparently being written. They're due next year sometime.
Okay. And it's applicable to the financial sector, really. Is that all?
It's the financial sector and it's heavily focused on their supply chain, especially obviously from a cyber resilience perspective.
So that's
So
that's pretty much everybody then, really. If you're supplying, if you've got
if
any
you're
interaction,
supplying in the financial sector, absolutely.
and any
Yeah.
interaction with the financial sector in the third party. Okay.
Yeah.
And although it's an EU directive, presumably UK companies are going to be affected by this. What about other companies or other organizations in other jurisdictions?
It's probably anybody who is part of the critical supply chain to banks that trade in Europe, because I think it's going to be very hard to say we only trade in the UK when you have European outlets or components. So yes, it could apply effectively everywhere. And the level of cyber IT due diligence is going to be much, much higher.
Would that be if the organization is based in any of those particular jurisdictions we've talked about, or that has a customer?
But potentially, yeah, because the financial entity is going to have to potentially prove that they've done the right level of due diligence on that supply chain.
Okay, so really, we all need to be aware of DORA and actually look at what our responsibilities are under that, any organization.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So there's a couple of components, and we're really working on the technical cyber components of Dora. There are lots of legal subtleties that need to be addressed as well.
Now, you put together a number of discussion points for this. So I'm going to share those with our audience here today. So this is really, we talked about what is DORA. It's effectively a regulatory framework for digital operational resilience, presumably to make sure every organization has got the right security and data protection protocols in place and are operating those.
You can
Given,
evidence them. Yeah.
I can evidence them, yeah, our favorite expression, evidencing them. Given that there are more and more and more cyber attacks going on, obviously this is getting more and more critical. And every firm, it's small, medium, large, they all need to be aware of what's required, especially if they are dealing with the financial institutions in any way. There needs to be a risk framework, clearly. We advocate this with most organizations we deal with. And what would be in that risk framework?
There's a whole number of articles. I think it's articles 17 to 27 that cover the kind of technical components. And that comes from ranging from managing an incident to effectively pen testing, managing the incidents, uh, evidence of testing, huge amount on what type of penetration testing they would like to see done, and making sure that those are also in the contract requirements as well. It's
So
not just have you done it, it's got to be part of a contract.
when you're dealing with third parties, whether they be suppliers or clients. Okay. And presumably there's a reporting element as well in there that you need to make sure that you are reporting any incidents. And that was also
Yeah.
covered under the Data Protection Act, clearly. But
It's similar, but it doesn't mean it's a data breach. It could be any type of security incident that has an effect. So doesn't necessarily mean it's a pure data breach. And I think the requirement on that is going to be 72 hours, very similar to GDPR.
so what sort of security incident are you talking about there? Give us an example.
Mhm. I guess they simply, there could be an attack on a system, which might just bring a system down for a short period. And I appreciate availability could also be a data breach, but sometimes they're not. And it depends on the context. It could be that they've seen something that prevents part of their operations from working.
So this could be internal as well as external.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And reporting, you mentioned that 72 hours. And again, that's a figure that features in the Data Protection Acts.
Yeah, and I think there's still kind of work to be done on some of this, but the plan is that they actually have criteria for what type of reporting is required, what level of category that triggers it. And I suspect it won't be anything radical that we're probably not aware of, but anything that affects their ability to deliver customers the service.
Okay. And managing third-party risk, this is a great area that we find more and more it requires attention, given that so many cyber attacks and data breaches happen in the third-party chain. In fact, I was reading.
Oh, they happen all the time. There was one literally last week that affected an MSP, managed service provider, that affected in the UK tens, if not hundreds of law firms.
I was reading an article the other day that many of these threat actors are actually targeting smaller companies who perhaps don't have the cyber security protocols in place in order to get to the larger organizations through that third-party chain. So clearly managing that third-party risk is.
Oh, the third-party chain is absolutely a prime target. And if you hit a service provider, you'll hit multiple targets potentially if they get compromised.
That's what happened with SolarWinds in the US, for example, that affected millions of different
Yep.
organizations. And clearly, information and intelligence sharing, that's something that we believe is absolutely critical. And again, this is something that was covered in our discussions with our law enforcement pals.
Oh,
and NIA.
absolutely. And intelligence sharing is an interesting one. I think we've identified 16 or 17 different types of intelligence sharing. We're not saying you need to do them all, but it's ones which would definitely benefit the organization. Some will be more useful than others for sure.
We had a very interesting conversation yesterday with a client about how there was an attack on one of the subsidiary companies on a Thursday just before a holiday weekend, and nobody told anybody until the Tuesday because they didn't want to ruin the holiday for everybody. Of course, it's multiplied its effect over that holiday weekend. So
Every minute counts. That's one of the things when we
reporting
work
and
with
intelligence.
companies.
Reporting
We
and
always kind of
reporting.
make escalation ASAP.
Yeah.
Every minute, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes counts.
Yes.
And yes, it's not convenient ringing people at 3 a.m. at a weekend, but it needs to be done.
Yeah, of course. So let's go on to the checklist for Dora. It's quite extensive. I think there's 17 different points here that we've identified. It'd be quite useful if we went through them. So the key thing here is really developing a digital operation resilience strategy. And you've believed that KPIs are required there and risk metrics so that you can measure on an ongoing basis.
Oh, absolutely. Because in every organization, things change, things move around all the time. And it's definitely worth having metrics to know where you are against best practice. And by best practice, that could be international standards, ISO 27001, SOC 2, ISO 22301, and government guidance, because they subtly change all the time. Was it this year? I think June, the government guidance classified different types of MFA. MFA is not MFA. There's different levels of MFA that can be put in place. And from what we've seen, yeah, the basic level of MFA, yes, it's better than nothing, but it's relatively straightforward to get around these days.
Yeah, interestingly. And you'd monitor those risks through something like a cyber risk forum, meeting regularly?
Yes, and it's having the right stakeholders who can report back on whether certain things are done or in place. One of the favorite questions that we ask a company, have you got MFA? They'll go, yes. The question we should really be asking, and we do ask that as the next question, has everybody got MFA?
Yes.
And is MFA on every platform that you use or an equivalent alternative? So just having something and making sure it's implemented to the right level is really where it needs to be.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. The next point in your checklist is create a communication strategy for incident disclosure. You mentioned escalation there, and clearly that's, I know, one of your favorite expressions, but having that clear communication.
Yes, so it's who to inform in the company, who to inform outside the company, customers, regulators, and having the right people to craft those messages appropriately and making sure that the messages ideally come from a single source.
Yes, so that there's
a single team. So
there's a
there's
coordinated
coordination.
approach.
There's coordination, yeah. And everyone can get updates as required. And those updates may need to be done every 15 minutes, every hour, every 2 hours, whatever is required.
It's fundamental in terms of any crisis communication that in order to make sure that everybody, including clients and suppliers, are aware and they can take the relevant action. But also from a reputational perspective, that's quite key for an organization to make sure that they're informed.
Oh, absolutely. Bad things will always happen. It's how you manage them that will be the assistance afterwards. And as we say, there's stuff you can do before an incident, stuff to be doing during an incident, stuff to be done after an incident.
Of course. Yeah. Plan for resilience testing. So this isn't just penetration testing. This is other types of testing.
No, this is making sure that things can still happen, even if some systems are down. An extreme example, if you rely on chat inside the organization, what if the organization's chat is down or is compromised? You need an alternative method to talk to the right people to help you fix this. So you may need multiple methods, and somebody's got to say, yes, we are now triggering this. And somebody's also then got to say, we are untriggering it. It's okay to go back to normal BAU.
Interesting. And establishing an ICT risk framework, is that an ongoing thing that has the risk?
It's an ongoing, yeah, obviously aligning with standard cybersecurity kind of frameworks and best practice and making sure that it's happening and making sure it's scoped correctly as well, because there could be areas that are maybe not included when probably they should be, because they could be opening the doorways to bigger problems.
The roles and responsibilities, it's not just the IT department that's responsible for all of this, presumably.
Let me give you a simple example. Payroll. Payroll may be managed by IT, but they're not responsible for payroll. And the availability of payroll, IT may be managing it it can be down for a week, but actually it can't be down for a week from a business perspective because it's payroll week. So those need to be tied up. That availability, recovery times are all aligned with business requirements, and IT will normally facilitate that, but they won't necessarily be responsible for making that decision.
So responsibility and operational responsibility. So governance responsibility and operational responsibility are two different things.
Absolutely, yeah. And linking those up is really important.
Okay. Policies and procedures for all of this and making sure everybody in the organization is aware of those is obviously quite important. You also said here implement independent assurance mechanisms to assess the framework effectiveness.
Exactly. So that could mean anything from a combination of internal audit, external audit, penetration testing to provide feedback that where these things are in place and are independent. It's always, if you're looking at your own kind of homework, which is not necessarily as bad as it sounds, but you might miss things and it's easily done. And the whole purpose is that the important things aren't missed.
And of course, there are standards against which we can judge a lot of this stuff, but having external expert resource in any cyber attack, for example, but as well as in this risk mechanism is actually quite a useful thing to do.
Oh, absolutely. And it also shows that you have to create a more defensible position, that you did the best you could with the resources that you have.
Yeah, when
the skill
reporting to
sets
the
that you
regulators.
have. Yeah.
Obviously, business continuity, we talked about reputation earlier, but business continuity is critical. So having some kind of business continuity plan and managing the breaches and the data protection within that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if there is any kind of incident, security incident or kind of stroke breach, those BCP plans may well come into effect really quickly.
Yeah.
And call them standard. There is no such thing as a standard BCP plan, but generally it will cover a number of high level scenarios, and each scenario may have 10, 12 different combinations that ideally need to be worked through and designed to be applicable to the business. And then ideally an impact assessment worked along with those, so business can actually see where they are for different scenarios. Weirdly enough, a lot of the key scenarios businesses had to test during COVID. Availability of staff, availability of premises, availability of transport, huge impact that you very rarely get all those scenarios in one go.
Key, presumably, to have both your incident response plan and your business continuity plan accessible so that people can actually get to them, whatever.
Ideally, which then means certain components of them shouldn't be kept on the corporate network exclusively. Obviously, they should be there, but if you can't access your corporate network or assets, you may need to have them kept elsewhere, even if it's down to having a piece of paper in your back pocket or a little card system with everybody's phone numbers on it and methods of communication.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because we have seen that quite a lot. People who go, I couldn't get the plan because I couldn't get into the office because I couldn't get access.
And I didn't know who to call because I didn't have any contact list other than on my phone, which has been compromised. Yeah, clearly. Conducting resilience testing on a regular basis, including penetration testing, that's something that we advocate quite a lot with any organization. And now it's becoming a requirement?
Oh, absolutely. Part of the Dora, they explicitly say they want to see penetration testing. They want threat-led penetration testing. They're relatively quite explicit on it of what type of testing they want to see. And that would also apply to their supply chain
That presumably will
to make
be,
sure it's robust enough.
yeah, and that will help assess what effectiveness and identify any vulnerabilities that can then be remediated, presumably.
Absolutely. And the vulnerabilities could be technology or process or procedure.
If we have a report, an incident, and we need to notify it and report, this figure of 72 hours comes up a lot. 72 hours is not very long. What should you be reporting at what stage? Is it what's happened? Is it how you are?
It may be, and that's where a potential risk assessment and alignment with the criteria for what defines a reportable incident needs to be done. And it may be that it's got to be done in stages. And I think this will apply similar to the GDPR, that you need to inform the regulator that this is ongoing, you are looking at it, and you will provide updates.
So again, as with any under the other data protection acts, we need to make sure that we are evidencing, we're recording everything that we're doing, we're recording the decisions that we're making, so that
Absolutely.
subsequently we can effectively justify them and show that we've had conversations, we've discussed the risk, and this is the decision we've taken. So again, evidence
Absolutely.
is really key.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Um, Managing the risk from critical ICT service providers through due diligence and monitoring. Due diligence is something that I think a number of organizations were not taking seriously, but we've started to see now a number of the security questionnaires coming out for the third party supply chain. And presumably that's where this fits in. Make sure that you have the right answers from your supply chain so that they are reflecting the security protocols and protection policies that you would like to see in place.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that we work with companies on is to make sure that you can compare your supplier's security posture with your own security posture. You can clearly see where there may be either gaps or maybe improvements to be made, or what maybe where they're outstanding.
Mhm.
And necessarily certain components you may want to say, actually, the supply chain's got to report on those every 3 months, every month, depending on the risks and the capabilities, rather than fill out a form once a year, which, yes, is a good starting point, but it may not be enough.
So it's ongoing due diligence, really. It's not just a one off.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because how do you know between the year that things are actually going as they should do?
And staff changes, personnel changes,
Staff changes, technology changes. Yeah,
organization
absolutely.
structure. Okay, very interesting. Um, Participate in information sharing platforms to exchange best practices and threat indicators. Now, this was an interesting conversation we had during some of our cyber simulation
Mm.
workshops recently with the law enforcement people that we had on our panels. In our particular case, it was with the FBI. And one of the things that they were saying is that at any point, if you feel that you're under threat or you have been attacked, contacting the law enforcement agencies can be a massive help because they have so much information about what has happened before, what the trend could be, what the next steps are in any kind of attack. So having access to and sharing your own information with those law enforcement platforms, enforcement agencies is something I think is really well advised.
Absolutely, along with the insurance company as well. And combining that information, because they may well have other information that you're not aware of that could be absolutely critical in making decisions.
Yeah, I think some of the negotiating organizations as well, the forensic analysis companies as well can help, organizations can help in this particular area. Are there any sort of openly available information sharing platforms that you would recommend people as
Yeah, we do have our favorites, even going from the basics, make sure you're on every kind of vendor's vulnerability list, email list or RSS feed, regulators, any legal law enforcement authorities feeds, just as a starting point. There are plenty open source information sources that you can apply to as well. Some companies, and sometimes they're government organized, have information sharing forums where everybody can meet up and discuss what's going on. All those generally are incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
That one piece of information may change how you think about what you need to do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think we've defined, isn't it, on our threat intelligence, was it 16 or 17 different kind of capabilities?
Yes.
So there is a lot out there that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Implementing a robust cybersecurity framework and then upgrading to the latest security software and hardware, the two of those things seem to go together to me. So making sure that you have the right patches in place, those kind of things. But the cybersecurity framework is much more than that.
Absolutely. In the UK, to do business with the government, you have something called Cyber Essentials, which basically means you have to patch and update within 14 days. Sometimes in reality, you may have to update quicker than that. There's always going to be an issue. Potentially, there will be some systems that if you update them, and this has happened many times, yeah, if you update it, the system stops working, which then means what do you do? There are ways that you can deal with that. It won't necessarily be the cheapest option, but it will at least keep you up and running and keep your entity safe.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely critical. The next two together are, for me, probably the most important elements of all of this, really, is that's training employees on cybersecurity best practices. But it's not just the employees, it's also the management or the leadership that needs to understand how anything they do in their day-to-day life
Oh,
will
absolutely.
impact.
And we work with many companies briefing their leadership of what to do, how to think about it, what would be expected of them. There are no surprises. Obviously, having an incident is a major surprise, but at least options you will have come across and go, okay, these are the questions we need to be asking. These are the decisions we need to be making.
So having the best practice and an incident response plan and having trained everybody on that and making sure everybody knows what the incident response plan is, albeit that it needs to be adapted to a particular incident, is critical because that way, when you're operating under panic, when you've been attacked and you have to make decisions really quickly under massive pressure and stress,
Absolutely.
you have
And
rehearsed.
who to call in, what resources you
Exactly.
might need. Nobody probably has enough burst resource. Nobody knows everything about every scenario. It's having the right people that you can call
So,
anytime.
so these two elements of training and actually having an instant response plan in place are regulations underneath the new Dora Act.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to some extent, it's evidence in them as well that they
Right.
are in place and
Yeah.
you have tested them and that is documented.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. Presumably, with any governance, with any regulation, the people responsible are the leadership team, the board of directors of any organization who report to the shareholders and obviously to the
Yeah,
customers and clients and suppliers. But the board
absolutely.
is really responsible for the governance, so responsible under DORA as well.
Yeah. And providing oversight and making sure that things are happening. And there is a way of not necessarily measuring it, but at least having an idea that it is being managed and the proper levels of controls are in place and hopefully are working as best they can.
But as you said earlier, operationally, it's everyone needs to be aware of what they need to do in their day-to-day job, whether they be an employee, a
Absolutely. And
contractor,
if
vendor.
somebody feels there's something wrong, they should know who to call as
Yeah.
quick as possible, even if you don't have the full information, because reality is you probably never will. You'll have some of it. And the faster it's dealt with, the better the outcome.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Thanks, David. That's really interesting. I think we'll be doing more and more on Dora, and we'll probably do another podcast on this as some of the guidelines become clearer. We've got just over a year before this is comes into practice. So
Strictly speaking, Dora came into force 2023, but it's not going to be applied to 2025. And there is still guidance on its way.
okay, so we need to review those on a regular basis. So we'll be back here talking about that in the next coming months. Brilliant. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much for that insight. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Penny.